and analysis of 19th century psychology and its relevance to Carnap's method and procedure in the Aufbau. So in the preface to the second edition, Carnap wrote the following, and there are going to be some walls of text here, but this is in many ways a history talk, so that's what you get. So in this book, I was concerned with the thesis that it's in principle possible to reduce all concepts to the immediately given. The problem was not to add to the number of philosophical arguments about this, but I wanted to attempt the actual formulation of a conceptual system. That is to say, I was going to choose some basic simple concepts, for instance, sensory qualities and relations, which are present in the raw material of experience. Then I was going to formulate on this basis further definitions for concepts of various kinds. So already there's something kind of intriguing about this quotation. So Carnap says, I was going to choose simple basic concepts, for instance, sensory qualities and relations, which are present in the raw material of experience. And if you're thinking of raw material of experience as sense data, for instance, or just sort of bare sensation, how can a relation already be present there in raw material? And the answer to that is, of course, that raw material does not mean sense data, or at least in the first iteration of the Aufbau. And so here I'm looking at Hannes Leitgeb's SEP article on Carnap. Carnap, this is from Leitgeb. Carnap considers various options for the choice of basic elements in basic relations. He chose, of course, elementary experiences in a single basic relation, the recollection of similarity. These were not, elementary experiences were not isolated sense data from traditional empiricism, as we find in Hermann Mach, but holistic time slices of total experience from which nothing has yet been abstracted. Carnap was here attempting to do justice to the psychology courses he had taken as an undergraduate, where he'd learned about the new directions taken in Gestalt psychology. So here I'm continuing to quote from Leitgeb. By quasi-analysis, which, etc., for many of you, this will obviously be familiar, the similarities among these time slices could retrospectively be grouped into something like equivalence classes. And by this means, Carnap constructs the subjective cognitive world of a single mind in some detail, etc. So here we already see, even though Carnap is beginning with elementary experiences, and he refers to this as the raw material of sensation, what he means by the raw material of sensation is not atomic sense data or something that is free of relational content, for instance. And when we're talking about relations, there are at least two kinds of relations at issue already in the Aufbau, already when we start talking about the autopsychological. First, relations that are present already in the raw material of experience, and second, the relation of recollection of similarity that generates equivalence classes. So just to reiterate, the Aufbau's raw material of experience is not atomistic sense data, but initially at least it's holistic experience, time slices of holistic experience along the lines of Gestalt theory. And at least in the Aufbau, Carnap does not begin with discrete parts of experience, but with time slices of the whole of perceptual experience. Now, just after the passage cited above from the preface to the second edition of the Aufbau, Carnap says he now wishes he'd done otherwise. So this is another quote from him. I should now consider for use as basic elements, not elementary experiences, but something similar to Mach's world elements, e.g. concrete sense data, for example, a red of a certain type at a certain visual field placed at a certain time. I would then choose as basic concepts some of the relations between such elements, so X is earlier than Y, spatial proximity, and so on. Now, so much time had gone by between the first and second editions that it's difficult to know, although it's fun to speculate about what had motivated Carnap to change his mind about this. But he goes on to say the following. A system such as the one I've just indicated, as well as the one given in this book, has its basis in the autopsychological domain. However, in the book, in the Aufbau, I've already indicated the possibility of another system form, this looks like a typo but isn't, whose basic concepts refer to physical objects. In addition to the three forms which are there given as examples, I would now consider especially a form which contains as basic elements physical things, and as basic concepts, observable properties and relations of such things. So he goes on to say that one of the advantages of this basis is that there's a greater degree of intersubjective agreement on the properties and relations that are relevant and important. He says all concepts which scientists use in their pre-systematic linguistic communication are of this sort. Of course, linguistic communication is important, and it will be here. Hence, a constructional system with such a basis seems particularly suitable for a rational reconstruction of the concept systems of the empirical sciences. So in the discussions within the Vienna Circle, Neurath and I subsequently developed the possibility of a unified system of concepts on a physical basis. And this is physicalism, which was presented in several articles by Neurath and Carnap. So we might have read Carnap's statement that he wishes he'd gone with Mach's elements in the beginning as a move toward the empiricist reductionism that he's often, I probably shouldn't have used the word accused, depending on how you feel about empiricist reductionism, but that people often read into Carnap, beginning with sense data and abandoning the idea of a richer starting point. But then Carnap goes on to say that he could equally well have begun with physical objects, including their observable properties and relations, which doesn't really seem like much of a move toward, like a later move toward empiricist reductionism or foundationalism. And I really think that, of course, in my reading of this, what Carnap was really aiming at was looking at the rational reconstruction of different types of starting points, different types of the autopsychological, and different ways of speaking about the objects and experiences that are the basis of constitution or of a constitutional system. And so accordingly, this is now changing. The next few slides are going to be quotes from Carnap's intellectual autobiography. And I promise that in the next section, we'll have fewer walls of quotes and more discussion of specific things. But Carnap says here in the intellectual autobiography that he was guided by the psychological facts concerning the formation of concepts of material things out of perceptions. This is going to become, of course, obviously very important for what I'm going to talk about next. And he says, but my real aim was not the description of this genetic process, how concepts of material things are formed out of perceptions, but rather the rational reconstruction of that process. So a schematized description of an imaginary procedure consisting of rationally prescribed steps, which would lead to essentially the same results as the actual psychological process that was followed. So for instance, material things are usually immediately perceived as three-dimensional bodies, but on the other hand, in the systematic procedure, they're to be rationally reconstructed. And I think everyone is already aware of how that works. And so continuing in the intellectual autobiography, I really love this quote, just as a side note. Carnap says, look, at first, when I made this analysis, this rational reconstruction, I did it in the customary way, proceeding from complexes to smaller and smaller components. So he took these holistic time slices and moved to smaller and smaller components of them, e.g. first from material bodies to visual fields, then to color patches, and finally to single positions. And he says, so the analysis in the end actually did lead to what Mach called the elements. And he says, my use of this method was probably influenced by Mach and phenomenalist philosophers, and we'll see in a moment who he means by this. And then I love that, but it seemed to me that I was the first who took the doctrine of these philosophers seriously, right? The only true reader of Mach and others. I was not content with their customary general statements, like a material body is a complex of visual, tactile, and other sensations, but tried actually to construct these complexes in order to show their structure. So not only is he saying that he was the first one to take the doctrine of these philosophers seriously, he's actually strongly implying that he took it more seriously than they did, because they made these sort of general vague statements like a material body is a complex of sensation, but Carnap tried to actually show how those complexes of sensation were constructed. Okay, so Carnap says, but that was the first thing that I did, but then there was a change in my approach When I recognized under the influence of Gestalt psychology, and this is probably, and some people here can probably tell us, this was probably when the Aufbau was substantially revised. I recognized under the influence of Gestalt psychology that the customary method of analyzing material things into sense data was inadequate. An instantaneous visual field and perhaps even an instantaneous total experience is given as a unit. And the allegedly simple sense data are the result of a process of abstraction. So this is a very important point that Carnap got from Gestalt theory. And he said, so I took as elements total instantaneous experiences rather than single sense data. Developed a method called quasi-analysis that, again, I won't rehearse since I think everyone's familiar. Okay. So he said this, ultimately, what he did then was construct a system of concepts on a phenomenalistic basis. The basic elements were experiences, but he says it's also very possible to construct such a total system of concepts on a physicalistic basis. And he says, so it's really a choice, whether you're going to construct a system phenomenalistically or physicalistically, but the ultimate aim is not really to describe that system of elementary experience and its and the reconstruction of judgments and concepts. The ultimate aim is not to describe that autopsychological basis correctly necessarily. It's to reconstruct the actual process of the formation of concepts. So the goal isn't to say this is the single possible autopsychological basis, and we'll return to this point. It's to really talk about, like, how do we actually get to the formation of concepts, and how do we get epistemic access. So he says, my main motivation was the intention not just to represent the logical relations among concepts, but also the equally important epistemological relations. But then at the end here, I think this is important, and this is, I think, well known, but I'm going to say more about it. The choice of a phenomenalistic basis was influenced by some radical empiricist or positivist German philosophers, Ernst Mach, Richard Avenarius, Richard von Schubert-Soldern, and Wilhelm Schubert. For the construction, I should say, by the way, parenthetically, there's not a whole lot of work on the latter two, as far as I know. If anyone knows of work on them that they'd like to recommend, I would love to hear about it, because I don't think there's as much work on them as there is on Mach and Avenarius, for instance, and there's not enough on them either. For the construction of scientific concepts on the phenomenal basis, I found fruitful suggestions in the work of Mach and Avenarius, and above all in the logical constructions made by Russell. Okay. So Mach, Avenarius, von Schubert-Soldern, and Schubert built on the sensory studies and psychophysical investigations of the relations between psychic and physical phenomena during the late 19th century that were carried out by Wilhelm Wundt, Hermann von Helmholtz, Gustav Fechner, and Mach himself. And this is from a really nice paper by Richard Staley on psychophysical investigation that's come out recently in History of Science, and I really recommend it. It's Richard Staley, 2021, in History of Science. These figures were all interested in the role of inference and conceptual reasoning in how our experience is built up. So I should point out that to Helmholtz, especially, the Gestalt experience that Carnap appeals to would already be full of inferential, if not conceptual, context. So this is already kind of suggestive that perceptual experience, or even sensory experience, to 19th century psychology, which I'm going to get to in a second, would already have sort of rich relational and inferential content built into it. So it's time now then to talk about 19th century psychology. Let me just do a quick check. Is everything okay? Can everyone hear and follow and so forth?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. Once I gave an entire talk and the people at the other end couldn't see the advancing of the slides, so I now check partway through. Okay, so we'll now move to looking at the sources in 19th century psychology and early 20th century psychology that Carnap mentioned. And I want to talk a bit more about what the epistemological problems and what the advances and philosophical and epistemological interests would have been in this tradition, and some of the things that I think Carnap was referring to and responding to. And then I also want to say a few kind of more speculative things about some problems that might have informed his approach here. So I really want to first acknowledge some of the excellent work that's been done and that I very much benefited from in studying this. These are just some of the people who have worked on this question. Lisbeth de Kock has many papers and a lot of work on this, on Helmholtz in particular. And you can see that the title of her paper here is pretty suggestive in Carnapian terms. Gary Hatfield's book, The Natural and the Normative, of course, and Michael Heidelberger's Nature from Within on Gustav Theodor Fechner. I also really want to acknowledge, and I'm going to cite a lot from Chiara Russo-Krause's Wundt, Avenarius, and Scientific Psychology, because of course this is obviously going to be a very, very important book in terms of the background to the Aufbau. And I think really, in a way, there's a lot of work that could be done just taking this this question of how Wundt and Avenarius sort of approached psychology and philosophy and the relation between those questions and the background to Carnap's Aufbau. And so I think this is a really rich set of questions that I'm only going to be able to gesture at in this talk. So there's a lot more to be done here and has been done by some. Okay, so Wundt, I'm going to have to remind myself, in 1877, wrote a paper called Philosophy in Germany for Mind, in which he gave a kind of rundown of what had been going on. And here he talks about the recent foundation of a journal edited by Richard Avenarius with the advancement of scientific philosophy for its aim. And he says, this foundation of this journal shows plainly that the time is past when philosophy can hope to live apart from the other sciences. So this is yet again the sort of cohabitation metaphor we see all the time. We see accordingly at the present time all interest turned on those two departments of philosophy that most account for the building up of, honestly, I think that should say psychology. I think I was copying and pasting, but I think that should say psychology. No, sorry, it shouldn't. It should say philosophy. That's the important thing. Sorry. We see accordingly at the present time all interest turned on those two departments of philosophy that are of most account for the building up of the universal science, namely psychology and the theory of cognition. That's funny. That was the whole point, is that these psychology and the theory of cognition here are considered to be part of a scientific philosophy. Okay. The philosophical movement in Germany presents everywhere the spectacle of preparation for a step to be taken. New weapons are to be being sought in the arsenal of experience and of the human mind, wherewith to carry on the old struggle around the eternal problems of thought and existence. So this is from Wundt's 1877 Philosophy in Germany, and Russo-Krause discusses this paper in detail in this article in detail in chapter 1 of her book. So here she notes that Wundt and Avenarius were dealing with the sort of well-known discussions around realism and idealism that were happening in philosophy, but that then had kind of moved, I'm not even sure the word moved is correct, had arisen in research in the physiology of perception and psychology. So this is Russo-Krause. On the one side, we have dualistic realism that believes in an external world affecting the inner world, thus causing experience in ourselves. This position is unable to explain how such different realms can interact with one another and how we can grasp outer reality. So this is where we get all these positions like psychophysical parallelism and Mach's sort of functional relationships between elements and so forth, where the idea is that there's an external, of course, Mach wasn't a dualist, but the idea is that the external world is supposed to somehow affect our internal sensations, and that we're somehow able to have access to this affection, describe it correctly. But then on the other side, we have monistic idealism that posits consciousness as the only reality we can deal with. From this perspective, we can't go beyond consciousness to reveal upon what it depends. Of course, both of these ended up being kind of adumbrated in very extreme forms, and this became a very well-known debate. So in the years we're talking about, which is the end of the 19th century, really, the contradiction between these two conceptions, idealism and realism, became particularly evident due to the latest developments of philosophy and psychology. So this is again Russo-Krauss. As noticed by Avenarius, while philosophy, thanks to idealism, discovered the immediate givenness of consciousness, psychology has to treat consciousness as a psychological concept, that is to say, as a phenomenon that is not immediate, but the ultimate outcome of a complex interaction between brain and environment. So this becomes very important, that actually I should linger on this slide a bit. We're going to talk more about this in a second, but the idea becomes that consciousness, perceptual experience, subjective experience, however you want to describe it, is not something that is immediate or given or intuitive, but rather is the result of already a process of formation, already something that's the ultimate outcome, as Russo-Krauss says, of a complex interaction between brain and environment, or between sensory system and sensory given, or whatever you want to call it. But there is no such thing for this tradition as a kind of bare given, right? There's already structure in what we sense, even, much less perceive. Okay, so one important point that I want to just note here is that, and this is very intriguing, given Carnap's later preoccupations, and given that Carnap says that he was influenced by Avenarius, Russo-Krauss points out that for Avenarius, language represents a way out from the antinomy of realism and idealism, or between internal and external experience, insofar as it gives access to a peculiar kind of experience, that of my fellow men. Unlike mine, the experiences of other people have a double advantage. They're a part of my experience rather than that of the inner realm, right? So this gets around the problem of introspection or introjection, that we're not just trying to like have access to our own subjective sensations, but we can observe the sensations of others. And they can also be subjected to a psychophysical analysis without improperly leading beyond experience. So when other people talk about their sensations in language, that can be a kind of evidence about subjective experience of other people. It can be scientific in a way that introspection is not, or at least so the argument will go. Okay, so I want to move on from that kind of, and I will return to the question of language and Avenarius later. But I want to move on to the idea that became very important in the late 19th century of psychology without a soul. And here I think those of you, I'm sure many of you here will know, this doesn't exactly mean soul. It's Zela, I think Lange uses here. The idea is Friedrich Albert Lange argued that there was a necessity of a psychology without the kind of inner subject or soul that had been proposed by earlier psychological theorists. And in the early stages of their careers, both, this is Russo-Krauss again, I really love this chapter, is just great. Wundt and Avenarius both believed in psychology without a soul, which means that the object of the new science should have been an empirical object, rather than the soul as the substantial metaphysical principle underlying all mental contexts. So accordingly, in the first edition of his Grundzüge, Wundt identified the object of psychology with inner experience. But so the idea was in order to have scientific psychology, scientific philosophy, then we need to not look at the soul itself or the sensing self, but inner experience. And so reports of inner experience, for instance. Avenarius comes to believe that the distinction between inner and outer experience is adventitious, as makes sense given his idea that the observations of the experiences of others and reports of the experiences of others are more scientific. But the reason that Avenarius thinks this distinction is false is interesting. So this is a quote from the paper that's cited on the screen. He says, since experience is unitary and homogeneous, every attempt to separate the two domains of the psychical and the physical ultimately result in mere verbal existences or metaphysical survivals. So the idea is when we try to divide up experience and find a way to separate what an experience is internal and what an experience is external, it turns out that any such division is going to be terminological or metaphysical. So we're just going to have named, well, yeah, that's enough to say. So we move into the next step in this neutral monism, where I'm not going to say a whole lot about the position of neutral monism, but I will, of course, recommend Eric Banks's excellent work on this topic and Alex Klein's also. But here I will just point out that this, Alex Sui has a nice paper in Interpreting Mach that's partly about Mach's piano and the idea of sensation in the case of sound and music. But here, Hui has a really nice discussion of how Mach responds to this question of the psychic and the physical, or the mental and the physical, or however you want to put it. So between 1860 and 1880, Mach moved past Fechner's conception that these were two sides of the same reality. So for Mach, this shared reality was predicated on duality, whereas his view was one of unity, or at least this is the reading here. So he jettisoned the distinction between things and sensations, outer and inner, between the material and spiritual world. So the world could instead be understood, he explained, to be made up entirely of elements like colors, sounds, and pressures. These could be described functionally as sensations or physical properties, but scientific study had to break out of habitual stereotyped conceptions of a dualistic world. So this is just a statement of neutral monism in other terms. So I just want to observe at this point, just to kind of, we will be drawing some conclusions and so forth in just a second, but I just want to observe at this point that this question of treating experience as a single monistic unit that can consist of elements that are neither mental nor physical, but both or neither, is seen, at least by some commentators, and I think some of those commentators include the people who were writing at the time, as emerging from this sort of debate in scientific philosophy, psychology, or the combination of the two, about what counts as internal, what counts as external, and the difficulty of distinguishing the two, the subjective and the objective, however you want to make that distinction. And I don't think that this is any kind of revolutionary conclusion, but I just want to note this as something that's obviously going to be incredibly important for the Aufbau project. And I just want to note here briefly that this is also something that's going to be important in figures including Russell and James. Russell, of course, was also a neutral monist, and there's an interesting recent paper by Klein about Russell's position on consciousness. But I'm not going to talk about that in great detail because I'm going to move on to Helmholtz. And here, I owe you kind of an explanation of why we're moving on to Helmholtz. And one of the reasons for this is that if we're talking about the background of psychology in the Aufbau and the idea behind the methodology of the Aufbau, it might seem surprising to mention Helmholtz, partly because he's never really mentioned much in the Aufbau. There are a couple of places where it might sound like he's saying something similar, and it might seem as if Carnap is indirectly referring to Helmholtz or to positions that he might have had. But the reason that I really have for bringing him up in this talk is that I really feel like if we talk about Gestalt theory, Mach, Avenarius, we're not really giving the kind of full picture of what was going on in physiology of perception and the theory of psychology and its relationship to physiology and psychophysics at the time. Because I think, and I'll explain why in a second, that what Helmholtz had to say is also at least directly relevant to the background of the Aufbau. And then the other thing I want to say is that he was kind of ubiquitous. So certainly, even if you didn't cite Helmholtz, you were aware that he was around and you knew what his work was and so forth. And so I think that there can be influences, although I realize that I may have to defend this later, that are in some ways just like, you know, that this person's work exists and it's been influential on other people. And Helmholtz, of course, was influential on Mach and on others. And so I want to make the kind of moderate claim that at the very least he was part of the background to what's going on in the Aufbau, and I'll say something a little more specific about that in a second. So of course here Helmholtz ages, I think it's 50 years in one slide. This is his earlier work on the sensations of tone, and that's of course a Helmholtz resonator. And then here is the book that I'm going to cite from mainly here. Of course, that's the ophthalmoscope on the right. And this is the Handbook of Physiological Optics, which is a very important book, not just for physiological optics, but also for section 26, where Helmholtz talks at length about his conception of psychology and its contributions to epistemology. And so this is what I'm really going to focus on. So one of the things that I want to point out, just to get started, is that there's an assumption that we often make about psychology in particular and the study of psychology, which is that it has to be kind of mental activity, and in particular, voluntary mental activity. So we don't always make that assumption, but it's a kind of implicit assumption in the way that we divide up the disciplines. But in some cases, in 19th century research into psychology, there were inferences that were ascribed to the mind, but that were considered to be involuntary, of course, without even going so far as to say unconscious in the way that Helmholtz did. But you could just say these are inferences that are almost analogous to a physical reaction. They're inferences that are made in response to experience, for instance, and they can have an influence even on a current sensation or perception. And Hatfield pointed out in The Natural and the Normative that psychological explanation in this tradition could include whatever operations are believed to mediate between the sensations produced by physiological processes and the final perceptual experience. Beiser, when he's talking about Hermann Lotze, points out that to Lotze, perception and sensation involve a complicated chain of events consisting of several stages. There's an external stimulus, it transmits nerve signals to the brain, transmission of signals from the brain to the soul, and the sensation of, and finally the sensation itself as an object of self-awareness. And the quality of the stimulus is transformed throughout this process so that in the end there's no similarity between cause and effect. This is, of course, the rejection of the copy theory, but the important thing that I want to note here is that sensation, by the time it becomes an object of self-awareness, has undergone a whole lot of transformations that can even involve mental intervention, and involves already a complicated process and chain of events to get to self-awareness. So Helmholtz, in again the section of physiologische Optik that that I mentioned before, has this famous quote, which is, if you are going to read one quote from him, this is it. Our intuitions and representations are effects, which intuited and represented objects have brought about on our nervous system and on our consciousness. To demand a representation that copied the nature of the representation, was true in an absolute sense, would be to demand an effect entirely independent of the nature of that object on which the effect was brought about. So all our human representations are depictions of objects whose kind essentially co-depends on the nature of the representing consciousness and is co-determined by its characteristics. Whoops, sorry. So Helmholtz outlines a theory in section 26, according to which sensible experience involves inference, When we perceive objects as colored, as having a taste or a smell, or as occupying a certain place in space, this involves, in some cases, inductive inferences from previous experience. So one is that the perceived color, taste, or smell is associated with an object in a distinct place in space from the subject, and other inferences include judgments of distance and depth based on sensory information. So for instance, Helmholtz talks about things appearing smaller when they are farther away or appearing darker, lighter, depending on perspective. He says that the distinction between the subjective and the objective in perception is an empirical question. And this is me talking now. And that question is constitutively influenced by a physiological account of the sensory apparatus and its role in perception. So to Helmholtz, we can identify which parts of sensation depend on the object and which on the sensory apparatus of the subject. But that requires specifying the range and sensitivity of the subjective side of sensation and perception. So in order to identify what's objective in our experience, we need a detailed account of the subject. So in my view, and I've argued this before, this is the paper on the slide, Helmholtz argues that we need causal reasoning to explain perceptual experience and even sensory experience. And he argues that this reasoning isn't derived from the objects themselves, but must be constructed in accordance with principles of association and judgment, rules of inference generally, about how we come to explain objects having an effect on our sensory and nervous system and how this comes to awareness. In particular, he emphasizes the causal role of the object in sensation and perception. So this is a quote from a different section of the book. The subsequent idealistic systems of philosophy of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel all emphasize the theory that the idea is essentially dependent on the nature of the mind. Thus, they neglected the influence that the thing causing the effect has on that effect. So the thing causing the sensation has on that sensation and ultimately on perception. So Helmholtz explicitly does not argue that thinghood or objecthood is a construct that can be derived directly or immediately from sensation. He argues repeatedly that perception of objects or objective properties is always a representation, and that such representations always involve inference. So inferences that are made in perception are inductive, but they're based on what Helmholtz refers to as a transcendental law of causality, which is that objects exist and are the causes of our sensations. And he says this is something that we just assume to be the case. In the Facts in Perception, Helmholtz gives his own kind of non-monist resolution of the realist and idealist conflict, in which he says the various gradations of the realist and idealist views are metaphysical hypotheses, which, as long as they're acknowledged as such, have complete scientific legitimacy. So the idea is, as long as we're aware of what is an observation or a deliverance of experience or a causal chain or whatever, and what is a metaphysical hypothesis, then that is entirely legitimate and valid. It's when we mix the two that we run into problems. So at this point, to sum up this section, and then we'll have one more section and we'll be done. There is an end. Mach and Avenarius, and perhaps Russell, focus on what I characterize as the conditions for functional representation. So that is conditions for demonstrating that a sensation depends on a reciprocal state of a subject, where both sensation and subject are considered to be constructs or abstractions from unified experience. Now, in some ways, Helmholtz's view is quite compatible with this, with the kind of monist view, in the sense that he argues that we infer from time-ordered sequences of sensations to conclusions about the objects causing those sensations. So this is an incredibly speculative slide, because as you can see from the weasel words, I'm not sure that I would throw myself in front of the bus for either of these, and you can help me by helping me to clarify these points. But I think that there is a difference in how these two groups depict epistemic access to facts or judgments about reality or actuality. So to Mach or Avenarius, possibly, it's the unified world of experience that's reality, and our conceptual constructs are abstractions. Whereas to Helmholtz, possibly, Even current experience is influenced by previous experience and inductive inference. So the goal is to analyze both of these to find structural relationships between experience and inferences. So one thing that I think is important is that we could really see if these are even if these are somewhat accurate. These are both kind of methods that we could find in early positivism. So I'm going to make some concluding, incredibly speculative remarks that you can haul me over the coals for, and hopefully then we'll have something to talk about in discussion. So in Epistemology Naturalized, Quine argues that the knowing subject that's implicit in Carnap's Aufbau and later in empiricism, semantics, and ontology is too thinly characterized. I'm not sure why he tried to find one in the latter. But I want to just point out that there's one really good reason for that, even if we accept that to be the case, even if we want there to be a subject in the Aufbau, and even if we want there to be a more sort of robustly characterized subject, we could point out that psychology and scientific philosophy, including psychology, in the second half of the 19th century and the first few years of the 20th, had explicitly tried to do away with the soul or the kind of inner subject reachable by introspection or unification. So I think that it's important, I'm just going to ignore the slide that's up there. It's important to point out that Carnap was really working from a psychology in Germany and Austria that wasn't really focused on characterizing the subject robustly. It was focused on things like differentiating the subject from the object of perception, figuring out what's subjective and what's objective in our perceptions and sensations, like Helmholtz did, or shifting focus to delineating what the world elements are, and abandoning the questions of subjectivity and objectivity altogether. So in many ways, I think it's not really a surprise that Carnap wouldn't really have been focused on the question of what is the subject as a matter of kind of a substantive characterization of the subject, because even a lot of psychology at the time wasn't really trying to do that. And so in some ways, he was working in a way that was very continuous with what others were doing, including Lange and Lotze and others. I'm going to there. Okay, I mentioned earlier also that many of the, why did I skip a slide? Yeah, so I did it for a good reason. I'm going to skip that slide, sorry. So also, I think that what Carnap was doing was partly reacting to these reactions to the debate between realism and idealism, however we might want to characterize this. And I think that one reaction to that debate that we see in Helmholtz and also in Avenarius, right? So there's at least one person who we know was an influence on Carnap because he said so, where people are saying, look, in order to get away from this kind of Charybdis and Scylla of realism and idealism, or this debate between realism and idealism, we can treat, as Helmholtz says in the Facts of Perception, we can treat the various gradations of realism and idealism as metaphysical hypotheses, which, as long as they're acknowledged as such, have complete scientific legitimacy. Or with Avenarius, we can say that language is a way to escape this kind of morass of the debate between realism and idealism. We can treat these as different ways of reporting on sensation, for instance, or different metaphysical hypotheses, or just a terminological difference. But we can kind of pull back from all of these debates about realism versus idealism and simply look at how do we have a scientific report of experience? And how do we explain how that scientific report of experience can be rationally reconstructed, right? Which is the central question. So as long as we recognize that a position about fundamental ontology or a choice of foundation for our system is a choice, it's legitimate to use it as a way of orienting ourselves. And interestingly, you find this position both in Helmholtz and in Avenarius, which is interesting. Carnap himself, of course, doesn't seem to recognize a privileged autopsychological perspective or language. That's the point of the principle of tolerance. And instead, he focuses on reconstructing the inferences and interventions that are necessary to recognize the objective content in our experience. All know that. Now, one thing, of course, that Carnap focuses on, just to get to the overall project of the Aufbau, is the question of intersubjectivity once we have constituted objects. So he continues in the third part of the Aufbau to analyze how subjective systems are coordinated to make up an intersubjective world. So intersubjectivity is the basis of public social reasoning, and of course it's not given but constituted. So I should point out that this is actually one difference between many forms of intersubjectivity and Carnap's. So there are many ways of arguing for intersubjectivity, beginning from a theory of psychology and then building from there. But instead, Carnap talks about building a constitutional system, right, and then drawing comparisons between it. So objectivity in the Aufbau is essentially connected to intersubjectivity. We can find this in section 66, for instance. And this is very much related to what Avenarius says about intersubjectivity being the key to, for instance, a scientific account of experience. Now, there is an important difference, which is that Avenarius suggests beginning with the heteropsychological so that it can be treated scientifically. So he says what we should do is start with analyzing reports from other people so that we can consider that to be scientific evidence that isn't introspective. Carnap instead begins with the autopsychological and ends with intersubjectivity, which has to be constituted. And so I think that's an important difference, and it's clearly a choice that he made since he was influenced by Avenarius, but he made a different decision. So this is from Chris Pincock's paper about the Aufbau. So this is just to kind of elaborate on this, and then I'll finish up. The last stage of the constitution system begins with identifying other humans and constituting their sensory experiences based on their actions and statements. This is, again, publicly available evidence. So Carnap then argues that there will be a kind of correspondence between experiences that we wind up attributing to others and what we've constituted for ourselves. This is called intersubjective coordination. In line with his earlier discussion of subjectivity and objectivity, the intersubjective world is the subject matter of genuine scientific investigation, and all claims about it are communicable to all agents. So again, instead of saying that the heteropsychological, so reports of the experiences of other subjects is the basis for the system, we begin with the autopsychological, again, whether phenomenalistically or physicalistically constituted or described, and then there are coordinations or analogies drawn between the resulting constitutional systems. So to sum up, and I'll be glad to say more about what I mean by this in the question session, I think Carnap is Helmholtzian, intentionally or not, when it comes to constitution. Why do I mean that? Because Helmholtz is really the one who talks about kind of going back and identifying the inferences that we already made in perception and sensation. What Carnap does and adds to that and changes with that is that he changes that finding the inferences that we already made that Helmholtz talks about with reconstructing, logical reconstruction, and reconstructing a kind of a constitutional system from that. Carnap is Avenarian in a limited sense when it comes to intersubjectivity in the way that I described, and tolerant when it comes to language. So I'll stop there.
So, thanks, Lydia. Wonderful, super. So now we have 5-minute break, and then we meet again at 5:30 for the Q&A.
Great.
You in a while.
States.
Silence, please. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks. We have a lot of questions. We have a question. I have a question. Lucas have a question. So I don't know now who was the first rising the hand.
I think Jerry was.
Maybe Rick Creeth can go first.
I can go first, but I think Jerry had his hand up long before I did. Jerry Chandler.
I don't hear you.
Oh, that's, you should. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. I can go first, but I think Jerry Chandler had his hand up long before I did. But anyway, I'll go. If you want, I'll go. Fine. Thanks, Lydia. That was very nice. I enjoyed it and I learned from it. Most of it, obviously, is about the Aufbau and its predecessors. But a couple of times you referred to the principle of tolerance. Do you, as I think I do, see the principle of tolerance at work in the Aufbau?
Yes, partly because of those passages in the intellectual autobiography that are from the relevant time and talk about the really interesting passages where he talks about how he noticed the different languages that people were speaking. I suppose I should say it depends on what you mean by the principle of tolerance. Because I think if you're reading it only as a sort of logical principle, then that would take a lot more to talk. If you're only talking about like different equivalents of different logics. But I think that when he talks about in the intellectual autobiography, when he talks about the languages that physicists used and that philosophers used and how they were clearly starting from different starting points, but that you could start from any of them and sort of reconstruct epistemological relations, I think that's at least an early version. I think maybe we could talk about like different versions of tolerance and different ways of I think people have talked about that. But maybe I'd want to hear more about what's behind the question, if that's a fair.
Well, on standard accounts, the principle of tolerance, of course, it's stated as such only in 34, but it pretty clearly appears in 32 on protocol sentences. But it's pretty clear also that when Quine interprets the Aufbau, it's usually mistaken, number one. And number two, he does not take the physicalist construction that Carnap seems to allow in the Aufbau seriously at all. He said it, but he didn't mean it, sort of attitude. And the autobiography could be an ex post facto reading back of his later view into the earlier one, but the passages from the Aufbau are there to stay.
Right. And I think right. And I think, I mean, that's always the concern. And that's why I had that weasel phrase about like, we don't know what motivated Carnap to say what he did in the preface to the second edition, right? Because of course there he says that he could have started equally well from a physicalist starting point or from a different starting point. And so, but I mean, if you ask me whether I think that it's there, yes. Could I stand up in front of everyone at the Carnap conference and defend it? Maybe not, but maybe now I've said so, I'll try to go find weapons with which to do so.
Okay.
So, Jeff Handler?
Yes.
I'm sorry, is that me?
Yes.
Okay, so Alan.
Hello, I hope you can hear me, Lydia, and everyone else. So I want to give you a bit of good news, and then I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
So the good news is there certainly is, at least at second intention, a clear connection to Helmholtz in the Aufbau. If you look at when he's beginning to clear his throat in the movement to the construction of the physical world from the autopsychological world, he first mentions an older work in Immanenzphilosophie by Max Kaufmann, but then he says, but the person who really did work in this that is useful and important, the first person who really tried to make this a mathematical problem was Karl Gerhardt. And Gerhardt, in that paper, the mathematical core of the external world problem, connects his problem directly back to Helmholtz and then to Mach. So that's the problem that Gerhardt thinks he's answering, and that's the problem that Carnap thinks that he's answering in those sections. So now my question, having given you good news, now you have to give me a good answer to my question, which is this. There's a suggestion in what you're saying, and I want to know if you mean to say this, that when Carnap later says that the important influence on the account of the autopsychological realm and the choice of the basic elements in the basic relation is Gestalt psychology. If you look at what he actually refers to in the Aufbau and what you're talking about here today, he's actually referring back to all this stuff in the 1880s and 1890s involving people like Schuppe and Foucault and von Schubert-Soldern and Helmholtz. He doesn't refer to Helmholtz, but it's all there in this sort of Immanenzphilosophie realm. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm wondering whether you mean to tell us that Carnap's actually mainly using older resources than the Gestalt psychologists who he claims to be relying on. And also a sort of secondary question, if I'm looking at all of these people who he does refer to in section 64 and 65, when he's talking about the choice of the autopsychological basis and whether the given has a subject, whether I should read these people who seem to be all immanence philosophers, that's what they call themselves, is that a way of saying that they're Machians, or is that a way of saying something else?
Oh. Okay. Well, I feel somewhat bad since you gave me the good news, but I'm not going to be able to answer that last question. I don't, but I think, but I can say something about it. So maybe I can answer it later. Sorry, were you going to say something? Yeah, okay. So so first of all, thank you for the good news. That's fantastic. Yeah, and I as I say, there's a lot of places, and I'll be quick about this, there's a lot of places where I think you can find kind of breadcrumbs, and that, and Helmholtz was in the air, etc. But this is excellent because this is an actual, like, more than breadcrumbs. Okay, so what are we to think of Mach versus Gestalt psychology? So there are two separate places where in what I quoted where he talks about this. So there's the part where he talks about Gestalt psychology and he mentions it specifically. And as you say, in the Aufbau, he talks about Gestalt psychology. I think in those places, like most of what he's talking about is where he refers to Gestalt psychology, he's talking about their criticism of the idea that experience can be that experience in the first place as it is experienced is built up out of simpler elements. And I think, although obviously those of you who are here can correct me on this, but I think that that's really what he's criticizing on the basis of the Gestalt psychology that he studied in that course that he went to, where he was convinced that that picture of experience was flawed. But I think what's kind of interesting and worth unpacking about that is that I wonder, and this is very speculative, whether the reason that he came to no longer accept that is that is actually to decide that experience is not this and that it is that, and that the autopsychological basis is this and not that, is kind of un-Carnapian in a way, right? So to say you can't build you can't describe the autopsychological basis as simpler elements being built up into. I think that might have been something that he later came to temper or decide wasn't exactly what he wanted to do. But that is entirely speculative, right? I think that's one way to describe what he says in the preface in his later reflections. But what I think that he separates them. I think that he says Gestalt theory was, I think that he says that Gestalt theory was an influence in the sense that it allowed him to criticize this kind of punctiform or sense data reading of experience and how it's built up in the first place. But then I think when he talks about the influence of Mach and Avenarius, I think he talks about it in a different context. He talks about it in terms of a different set of concepts and a different set of ideas, including the ones that I just talked about, where, for instance, Avenarius talks about language and intersubjectivity and so forth. Does that answer your question? As you can tell, I'm kind of floundering around trying to answer it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I think by and large it's right. But I'm just now with the sacred text,
right?
And it's interesting to me, in light of what you've been saying, that in 67, when he's talking about the choice of the elementary experiences as these total units, there too he actually refers back to people, not just the Gestalt psychologists, but he refers back to people like Gompertz and to Schuppe and to the immanence philosophy.
Okay.
Which is work that's being done decades before what the Gestalt psychologists.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Interesting.
Great. Yeah, I really feel like it's interesting that Schuppe and the others like that. There's as I said in the talk, like there's not enough work. It's really interesting. Also, this whole discussion. This doesn't add much, but I will say that this kind of, it's not true that Carnap didn't cite anybody. Just say, okay. Thanks.
So, Mikro Starza.
Hi, Lydia. Beautiful background. Don't you have to defend your view against Carnap's recollections when he writes the German philosopher Mach and phenomenalism, etc.? Because you well argue that this Helmholtzian tradition, if you wish, and the Machian tradition somehow go together. The elements are meaningful if they are in a functional dependency or a complex of elements. And Cassirer thought that in 1910. And Mach defended himself against Planck. This is not these elementary elements, they make sense in a complex. But sense here, it seems that it gets lost a little bit, also in the broader discussion, also in Vienna, when they think Mach is more or less.
We cannot hear anything, so it's very disrupted. So the audio.
That Mach is the philosopher of the renewed enlightenment, and that somehow phenomenalism is now really a position that's kind of Russellian or protocol. So that there's kind of a shift, because this problem that there's phenomenalism versus the physical, doesn't exist in 1910 for Cassirer, Mach, and this Gestalt. I don't say that this is a sharply defined position, but I think my view in 10 that Carnap doesn't see anymore in the 50s. So I was wondering where's the Aufbau of the 20s.
Right. Yeah. So I knew. First of all, I knew when I wrote it that statement that like Helmholtz and Mach can be seen as having in some sense a common project. It's a little bit contentious, and I'm not sure I'm ready to defend it vigorously. All I wanted to say in that case is that it's actually surprising that if you look at what Helmholtz was trying to do functionally, what he was talking about was trying to make causal inferences about time-ordered sequences of perceptions and go from that using causal principles to conclusions about the objects that are the sources of our sensations. And that is, if you stay at that level and you don't make any ontological claims at all, and you don't make any claims at all about the constituents of experience, and you don't make any claims at all about like anything else, that is a kind of similarity of method between the two of them that I thought was interesting. Having said that, I think that the similarity stops there, right? Because what Helmholtz was trying to do, what he was trying to show, right, was almost diametrically opposed to what Mach was trying to do and trying to show, right? So Helmholtz was trying to, as for instance, distinguish between the subject and the object, right? That's something that like Mach would say is just an abstraction from, or at least the later Mach, right, would say is not the project that we want to go on. And there are tons and tons of differences. So I didn't mean to say, in saying that anyone who's engaged in a Helmholtzian project and a Machian project at the end of the 19th century is doing the same thing overall. I just meant to observe, isn't it interesting that, like, in terms of their method of making claims about the process of how we come to have sensations and perceptions of objects, there are certain kind of functional similarities. And just to, since you've given me the opportunity just to say something about like, so what does that mean for Carnap, right? I mean, I think that the fact that by the end of the 19th century, there is this kind of method that has arisen in physiology of perception, in psychology, of tracing out the genetic process of perception, of how we come to have perception from sensation, how we come to have sensation and awareness of sensation in the first place. Like that was, in a way, a necessary condition for then being able to say, okay, now my project is to go back and reconstruct that process, right? So you have to construct the process, you have to have an account of the process in the first place in order to reconstruct it. And so in some ways, that's all I was saying, which is kind of a minor point to put it.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a minor point. I didn't think that you constructed some sort of a Helmholtzian position, but if we look at this with our history of science eye, or history of the science philosophy eye, you often see, and Mach is notorious because he agrees to so many diverging positions in his writings, that certain problems are configured in a way that seems somehow still reconcilable, and that later interpreters or the people themselves then straighten it out into different positions. And that this is sort of exactly what Carnap does, and that the answer might not necessarily be, okay, can we trace this back to a longue durée influence? But is it just that Carnap of a new generation makes somehow a decision, adopting some reasoning of Mach, adopting some reading of others, how he would configure the problem? And then we get forerunners of that problem, which is not as if we will look at the debate as it was in the day. That was just my point. And I think there we can agree.
I think so, yes. Thanks.
Thomas Jubel.
Hi. Oh, I think you're muted. Sorry, Thomas.
Yes.
Can you unmute him?
Unmute me.
Yeah, just
Wait.
click on them.
How?
No.
No. Thomas, you are muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes. Okay.
Sorry about that. I'm not very good with even my own computer. Okay. Thank you very much, Lydia, for very, very interesting talk, sort of going through the various psychological influences on Carnap. My question is probably a little bit naive, actually, most likely is. I wanted to ask you what you make of a possible perception, namely that there's a certain or seems to be a certain tension, at least between certain things. You've shown very nicely, or argued that certainly argued that there are aspects in which Carnap picks up lines of inquiry, lines of thought, suggestions from Avenarius and from Helmholtz, and both of those are kind of, I mean, Avenarius, for example, you point out, he starts with a heteropsychological, and Helmholtz, you pointed out, in his investigations of perception, he already takes for granted that the human subject is in interaction with a physical environment and all that stuff. So these are quite, so to speak, physicalist positions of a type, right? And yet, at the same time, as you point out early on, when you reflected on the preface to the second edition, you mentioned what Carnap actually does in the Aufbau, namely that he chooses as a principle and for the structure of his rational reconstruction, to start with from the basis of methodological solipsism in order to represent, as he says, the epistemic order. So I see a certain contrast there between Carnap's opting for the epistemic order with the methodological solipsism as basis. On the other hand, the scientific psychological influence or inspiration, whatever, that he gets from Avenarius and Helmholtz. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit to that.
Yes, that's good. So the scientific, so right, you're right that the tendency of scientific philosophy and the connection with psychology is against methodological solipsism. And so, as you say, then we could perceive a tension between those two, especially in Avenarius. I think that maybe Helmholtz might be in, and here, yeah, it's possible that one thing that I could do is just emphasize more the differences rather than the similarities between the sort of Mach Avenarius approach and the Helmholtz approach here. But I think, let me say more about what that tension might be, right? Which is that Carnap does say very specifically that he chooses to start with the autopsychological, and then later on, and to an extent at the time, he says that there's different choices that you can make, but that they are always going to be the autopsychological basis, right? We're not going to start from, he doesn't mention the heteropsychological unless, well, there's certainly plenty of people here who can tell me he does, if he does. And I think that what you've put your finger on is that the interesting question is, why does he think that it's necessary to start from to start from solipsism in order to represent the epistemological relationships involved, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the interesting question, is why does he think, because Avenarius doesn't think that, right? He thinks that he comes to think in responding to the idealism realism debate that the only scientific way is to start from the heteropsychological, right? And so it becomes kind of an interesting question, right? Like why do they reach these differing positions? Helmholtz, I think, I'm trying to think, I've read a lot of Helmholtz, I have books of his, I'm trying to think whether he ever says anything about it. I'll have to look. I know Mikhail Heidelberger is here, so he might be able to tell us. But I think, yeah, I don't think Helmholtz ever actually says whether, like, why he chooses individual psychology or physiology of perception. And then that would again be an interesting question. Like, does he ever discuss this question? Certainly in section 26, he focuses on the individual. He looks at individual psychology. In his methodology and physiological and psychological experiments, mostly physiological, it's all one person. But that's not an explicit choice, and he doesn't link it to epistemology. He doesn't say this is the only way that we can possibly have access to the epistemological relations. So I think that is something that is in Carnap and is not in certainly not in Avenarius. The opposite is there, and it's the element of sort of deliberate choice in order of an autopsychological foundation in order to represent epistemological relations is not definitely, as far as I remember, not in Helmholtz, but someone else here might be able to tell.
Could it be that this is maybe the influence of some of the philosophers he's read, like Schuppe, and there's somebody else whose name just another guy with a double-barreled name who also talks about the given and all that kind of stuff. Whether it's the influence of those who sort of counteracts a little bit the sort of scientific input from Avenarius and Helmholtz.
Yes, that's
maybe.
I think that's right. Well, or recognizing who I'm talking to, or Neurath, or Schlick, or I mean, there could be other people who think. But that's a very large question. That's a much larger question that I won't even, that I'll forget I even said.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Karin Robinson.
Karin.
She's not there.
Oh.
Here she is.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, everyone. Okay, thanks so much, Lydia, for that really fantastic talk. Some interesting stuff that I knew very, very little about. I suppose the question that I want to ask has to do with, in a sense, what I understand Carnap feels the purpose of philosophy is. So I agree that Carnap doesn't give a substantive theory of the subject, but I am maybe with you. I wasn't absolutely clear about, in the end, whether you think he did or didn't give a substantive theory. But I'm wondering whether he or any other philosopher actually needs to, or even should, for that matter, give a substantive theory of the subject. So two of the reasons why I think that is, philosophers don't study physiology, so their theories would be weak, and some would say lack the needed expertise. Knowing the physiology of a subject requires very technical empirical work. Until today, I would have thought that Carnap would have agreed with this. So when I've been reading Aufbau for this project, and you read about the autopsychological basis, I kind of nearly think of it as a conceptual contribution on his side. I didn't realize to what extent he took the psychological investigation of it so seriously. But now I think perhaps I was wrong. Maybe that is a very strong part of his theory, and it isn't intended only to be a sort of a conceptual, argumentative contribution, but in fact, he means for it to be more substantively interpreted, in which case then he does need to give a more substantive theory. I would agree with that. But I also want to say that naturalists, as we know, prefer to move debates in epistemology, for instance, to physiology for all the reasons they're famous for. But it seems to me that we should all, at base, assume that knowledge is physiologically bound. So I don't think there's anyone would disagree, especially not in this room, that knowledge isn't somehow bound to our nervous systems and our brains and so on. So even knowledge based in rational procedures are physiologically bound. So the debates, the way I see them, and I assumed that this is the way Carnap would have also seen them. The debates about, for instance, the distinction between the a priori and the a posteriori knowledge are debates about how we should think of different types of propositional content. So it moves into the linguistic realm. So it's a theoretical question, can we know in this way or that? In other words, such debates occupy positions about meta-theoretical distinctions. None of them can be solved or undermined by understanding the physiology of the subject. So does he perhaps not provide such a theory because he thinks it's not really philosophically relevant? I'm not sure whether that makes sense as a question.
It does, yes, yes. Right, and that's obviously a part of the discussion that I characterized very thinly, this the criticism from Quine in Epistemology Naturalized. And it's kind of unclear exactly what he meant by that. Maybe just, you know.
Yeah.
Well, no, I won't say something flippant because but I think you're right. And I think in many ways that's what I meant to say by saying that in some sense, what a lot of people in what people working in psychology and physiology were doing didn't depend on saying, first we will explain what makes the subject distinctive, right? Like first we will explain the characteristics of the subject, and then we will explain psychology, you know, on the basis of the faculties of the subject, for instance. That just wasn't the methodology, right? The methodology was more a kind of genetic one, describing the process of like how nerve ending, like literal sort of nerve endings are activated, and then there's this process of moving from nerve endings to the brain, and then ultimately to awareness and so forth. And I think that what I meant to say was not that Carnap has a robust substantive theory of the subject, and that it's that you know, that the autopsychological is a robust substantive theory of the subject. Because I think I said this in a couple of places, and I maybe should have emphasized it a bit more. That's kind of not the point, right? Because you don't want to say, here's what the subject is, and here's the subjective experience that we're going to, and it's the subjective experience that we're going to explain, and so forth. It's rather like, no matter what autopsychological basis we choose, right? So Gestalt theory, Mach, physicalism, whatever, the point is the rational reconstruction of that process, right? So the point is not a, you know, deep dive into like nerve endings or mental sort of voluntary mental inferences or something like that, or involuntary mental inferences, as the psychophysicists were talking about at the time. But rather the idea is, well, because other people had done so much research into these processes, because Helmholtz and Mach and Avenarius and others had these kind of rich, robust descriptions of the genetic part of psychological process, then Carnap could afford to sort of wave his hand and say, whatever the processes may be by which the subject comes to have rich initial experience that we're taking slices of, for instance, if we use the initial Gestalt theory, that needs to be rationally reconstructed in order to lay bare the like epistemological relations that make conceptual knowledge possible, right? So I think it's I kind of go all around the tree in order to get like back to the, I'm mixing my metaphors, but you see what I mean. I'm kind of going all around to get back to the original reading, but
thank you.
With more background, yeah.
Thanks for that answer.
Thanks.
Thanks. It would be my turn and Lucas, and then Oliva. I have a couple of questions that are, I think, in support of your reading. I ask my question as a sort of tentative expert on quasi-analysis, and I don't know, maybe I have missed a detail of your presentation, but did you mention perhaps the Erlangen conference?
I did not, no.
No, but why I cannot?
Can you not hear me?
Yeah. Do you hear me if I talk without the
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So
I did not mention the Erlangen
exactly.
conference.
No, I mean, it is a very interesting point in support of your reading, I guess, because you are claiming since the beginning that the psychology was important for Carnap's development of rational reconstruction. And this is important because I think in the intellectual autobiography, he refers to the Erlangen conference and this debate between Levin and Ernst about elementarism and anti-elementarism related to experience. Okay, and there it is rather clear that he had talked about quasi-analysis, and yeah, and it is interesting because the more you apply quasi-analysis to psychological cases, the richer the axiomatic theory becomes. So in Aufbau, it is poorer. He has fewer actions than the one that you find in Quasi-Zerlegung. And Quasi-Zerlegung, according also to Carnap's own story about the Erlangen conference, it was sort of connaturated to a psychological debate, which in that case was this that I would resume as elementarism and anti-elementarism. So this was, I think it's something that may support your reading. And then I have a curiosity or an observation related to Banks. Because Banks has sort of, he saw a divergence between Mach and Carnap, both in the 2003 book and in the 2014 book. And I think he was rather wrong there, and maybe mostly because he didn't consider much rational reconstruction itself. And but however, I think that when you had the slide with Helmholtz and Mach and Avenarius, I think there Banks was right, because I think as you explain it, as soon as you look at quasi-analysis or rational reconstruction from people that has defended rational reconstructions, for instance, against Hermann, they usually raise a case that resembles more Helmholtz than Mach, because as you presented it, Mach and Avenarius had a from scratch idea of reconstructing reality from experience, while Helmholtz has this idea of a process that has been done before. And usually people defending rational reconstruction against some objections usually focus on the fact that Aufbau is not a project from scratch. It is a project where you have to assume something, and from there you start. So these were my two questions, and then we have Lucas and then Luca Oliva. Thanks, Lydia.
Excellent, thank you. I really appreciate the reference to the conference, and I will look at that much more carefully, because I think that you're right, that I mean the Levin-Ernst debate could be really important. And and Gerhardt's was at Arrow, even better. Okay. Yep, sorry, let me make a note of that. Great. So that's perfect. As you say, that's hopefully grist to my mill. I'll have to look and see what they say. But I think, yes. So I also really loved, am I saying this correctly when you said something like the more you apply quasi-analysis, like the richer your axiomatization can become? Something, did you say something along those lines?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in Quasi-Zerlegung, in the manuscript, Carnap applies this to a sort of, I would say, psychological case, because he has sounds, chords.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And he wants to reconstruct what are the precise sounds that constitute the chords. And this is, I think it is a case that we may label as a psychological case, or a case related to perception at least. And there he has at least has two more axioms than the ones that he put finally in the Aufbau. So it is rather clear that this idea of applying the structural description is very related to a sort of a reflection from Carnap in psychology, or the psychology at his time, for Russian translation,
Absolutely. And I think that I mean, I'm not going to be able to go into a huge amount of detail here, but I think that reaches into this very important complex of questions, right? Which is, you know, which this background I think raises for the Aufbau, which is that, you know, again, I don't think it makes any sense to say that Carnap thought any one of these descriptions of the autopsychological was like the description of the subject's activity, or the, you know, the only possible way to represent the process of perception or sensation or something like that. But rather, I think the idea is, that something like what in mathematics Hilbert called the deepening of the foundations, right? Like getting a richer sense of how the different rational reconstructions of different autopsychological bases, for instance, might make our axiomatizations richer, or might make our foundations richer. And I'm not sure how much we need to maybe move beyond the Aufbau to get to something like that. But maybe not. I mean, I think it would depend. You'd have to go back and read and look. But I think that something like that kind of Hilbertian method might be appropriate to describe how this is going. Because the idea is, well, then in that case, if that's your goal, is the deepening of the foundations and the richer axiomatization and so forth, then tolerance or pluralism about different autopsychological bases, for instance, is going to be a positive thing. And so then we learn more about psychology along the way. So it fits in well with the rest of his project, I guess, is what I would say.
So, can you hear me well?
Yes. Hello.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the talk, Lydia. It was very interesting. So I would like to go back a little bit to Rudolf's question.
Yes.
So in Chiara's book, and I agree with her, for instance, one of the major points already in the introduction is not only displaying this development of scientific psychology in the 19th century, but also to deny the conflation of Mach and Avenarius. So they had very different perspectives in key philosophical issues and psychological issues. So when Mach says that Avenarius agrees with him, he's talking about the Avenarius from the minimum amount of effort, which is way before his mature works, in which completely reshapes, and also the description of cognition in both are completely different. So the Vital series is basically a biological physiological description of how cognition works. That is a kind of mixture between reflex action and apperception. And whereas in Mach, you still have like this big principle of economy that doesn't really apply to Avenarius' later work. So given that, what I would actually like to question is, how much do you really think you can ascribe of Avenarius in Carnap? So because if you take the notebooks and the reading list, Avenarius almost never occurs. So he's not in the reading list. You can maybe say that he read Avenarius between 24 and 28, because we don't have the reading list of this time, but otherwise it doesn't occur. And whenever Avenarius occurs in Carnap's papers, it's always connected to all of these other guys, somehow conflated with Schuppe, Mach, and all those other things. So in Avenarius, like this whole idea of an autopsychological basis would be a wrong conceptualization of the experience section. So solipsism is not only like a different framework, it's an introjectionist perspective. And when you take, for instance, not criticizing methodological solipsism or even the phenomenological basis in protocol synthesis, he says those are meaningless duplications, just like Avenarius used to say, and then he recalls the natural conception. So my first question is, can we really ascribe much influence from Avenarius to Carnap? Because I think he's just a part of the bunch according to Carnap, and he reads him as a phenomenalistic guy, and that's definitely not what you get when you actually read Avenarius. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think the connection between Helmholtz and Avenatti is rather puzzling. So I don't know how you can actually mix both frameworks. Specifically because Avenatti believed that a causal conception of perception wasn't the major source of introjection. So you cannot have a causal theory of perception, because that's a wrongful idea, and that makes it impossible for scientific psychology to occur. So I don't know how can you actually conflate both frameworks, since they have such a basic disagreement on how to conceptualize basic psychological phenomena. And that would be the second question.
Okay, thank you. I agree with all of that. I think so. The goal of I think everything you just said is like I don't unless I'm missing something, I don't disagree with anything, and I don't think I said anything that disagrees with that. What I'm saying is that this was, I think maybe what I may have said is that so again, I think I need to delete that slide where I said that because I think it may be misleading. What I said was that if you look at a very broad methodological level, there is a similarity in method between some of these approaches to the genetic reconstruction of perception. But I think that I probably shouldn't have said that, because it's something that needed a lot more context in order to motivate. So what I certainly didn't mean to do is to say that the goal of Mach and Avenarius, considered as different, was the same as Helmholtz's goal. In fact, I mean, I tried to keep that quite separate. I think that there are differences. There are way more differences than you mentioned, right? There are many differences between what Helmholtz was trying to do and what Mach was trying to do, even though they were influential on each other even. And there are even more differences between Helmholtz and Avenarius, and between Avenarius and Carnap, on the other hand. I think one of the main points that I had in bringing this up is just to bring up the way that the questions that Carnap is dealing with in the Aufbau were set up, and the resources that he had to draw on. And I will, and so I think that I didn't intend to say, here's what I didn't intend to say, and maybe I'll just say this, and then, because I think there are more questions, so I'll be quick. Here's what I didn't intend to say. Mach, Avenarius, and Carnap all got together like the Vienna Circle and came up with a completely, coherent program that they then bequeathed to Carnap, right? That is clearly not the reality. It's nowhere near the reality. That's not what I intended to say. What I intended to present was something more like, there was a set of reactions to the debate between what was characterized at the time as realism and idealism. There was a set of reactions to the problem of reconstructing sensation, awareness of sensation and perception. And that set of results, reactions, responses, etc., were all available in the literature, and Carnap made use of them to varying degrees of detail and influence. And I think that in many ways, I just intended to bring this up so that the details of it can be worked out, right? Because I certainly didn't intend to say, like, here's the entire detail of all of the, right? Because this, of necessity, because there was so much said, I had to be kind of broad in mentioning a bunch of different people. And so it's very useful then to get more of the detail. And, but yeah, so I hope that that's satisfactory, but absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. We have two last questions, Luca Oliva and then Mika Stolzner.
Hey, Lydia, so thank you for your talk. I appreciated the reference to Avenarius in relation to Carnap. And so I was wondering whether you have, maybe I missed it in your talk, mentioned also the notion of protocol sentences in Carnap. Yeah. So my question about this is that I find it interesting the way in which the analytic developments of Carnap have taken form in the United States of America. So, I mean, the tradition that comes from Quine and especially Putnam, because Putnam gives a lot of emphasis, puts a lot of emphasis on the notion of causal connection. So to build our concepts and for just to rooting his notion of external reference and meaning. So there is a really very interesting parallelism between what you said today, what actually Putnam says in the collections of essays in 1981. I don't know, the famous Brains in a Vat, but also two philosophical perspectives. So, so my question is how you see this this relation is mostly due to the influence of Avenarius on Carnap, or it's maybe as a complete independent development of these analytic philosophers? I know it's a tricky question.
So no, it's a great question. It's a great question. I don't have 2 hours to answer it. In many ways, if I had 30 lives to live, right, one of them I would spend looking into like American United States philosophy in the like 1930s through the 1960s and all of the things that they messed up, and including Kuhn, the reception of Carnap and Quine, all of this stuff, right? And there's, I mean, in many ways, I think a lot of us were kind of taught these sort of very, like, I remember learning about Putnam and learning this kind of almost cliched, you know, just mind and reality sort of way of thinking. And I realize I'm being vague, but again, it's hard to kind of distill down. But I think that the relationship between Putnam and Quine is in some ways, and the way that developed is in some ways responsible for our reading of much earlier philosophy, and in a way that I think hasn't actually been great for the accurate reading of that philosophy. So I think, and I realize that that's kind of a promissory note, but I'd be more than happy to like elaborate on it at a later time. But just to say something more specific, you mentioned protocol sentences. In the preface to the second edition, when Carnap says, "I wish I had started from something more like Machian world elements," the description of what he means by that actually sounds a lot more like a protocol sentence, right? I mean, or a protocol proposition. I mean, so it sounds more like a time slice of the color green in this particular part of the field or whatever, right? So it's a lot more kind of publicly reportable, like single, et cetera, right? And so I think there is a sense in which Carnap later on looked back and said, like, maybe I could have, that passage at least could be read as saying something like, I regret not having set that up in a way that would have maybe motivated. But that is incredibly speculative to say, right? It's just, it sounds like that. I don't know of anything, I don't want to say anything more than that, other than my ranting about American philosophers, and I didn't even get to Davidson. But I think that, yes, I can say a lot more, but I think you're right that there's a way of thinking about, especially Carnap and Quine, that is heavily influenced by kind of later developments in philosophy that have gotten projected backwards. And I think that it's very important to kind of disentangle those strands. And again, I can say a lot more about this, but maybe not right now. Is that okay? Sorry. Oh,
That's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
answer. So,
no, that's excellent. Thank you.
Last question, Michael Stötzner.
Yeah, I mean, I share your fascination for deepening the foundation and Hilbert, but the manifesto is clear to say there's surface everywhere and there are no depths. And I mean, if one reads Hahn, one knows that he means Hilbert's talk about that as well. And so one could say, well, isn't what you say only acceptable when the tolerance is so strong that one could say, okay, there are different ways to logically reconfigure something, and what's the depth in one formal framework is not at all deep in the other formal framework, and it's nevertheless good to have framework A and B that we can reveal some Tiefenstruktur.
Yeah.
So where's the suspicion of I think some would be suspicious of metaphysics, which I'm accepting, but in Vienna that might be a problem.
Oh, but no, that no, I wasn't at all intending to. Gosh, no, no metaphysics. So no, yeah. So manifestos are an interesting political phenomenon, right? I mean, like there is no such thing as actual collective writing. Somebody writes one part, somebody writes the other, and then we all vote, and it's like a faculty meeting. So, I mean, I think there's like that, but yeah, I would read. So, for instance, what I thought was very interesting about Katerina's question is that there are later texts where we find something of the axiom, like empiricism, semantics, and ontology, but the physics, the philosophy of physics book has a lot of really interesting stuff on like the axioms of physics and their status. And I do think that there's something I agree with. I think it's Tilman Sauer who said that there's something of that there's a Hilbertian kind of flavor of some of that work. And I by Alan, I agree with that. I certainly don't think that it is a step along the primrose path to metaphysics, though. I definitely never intended to imply that, right? That wasn't I don't think it is for Hilbert either, right? I mean, I think Hilbert thought you're deepening the foundations, but you're not necessarily getting closer to some kind of truth. It was more like he talked about fruitfulness, and he talked about, but that's getting on to Hilbert is a whole separate question, right? And we can talk about that another time.
Yeah. I mean, and I wrote on these various types of that. It's just interesting that you see this because it's a thorny issue from the ideological perspective, how the Vienna Circle configured math.
Yes.
But from the whole history that you outlined, things are not all at one level, not even in Mach, right? So, and that's it's a problem that's there that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and
so
and I think
I'm with you. I just was more to metaphysics.
Yes, absolutely. And I think just to quickly, because I know we're going to wrap up, to quickly get back to Luca Oliva's question also, I think that there is this question about what does it mean to say that you're coming up with a scientific theory, and that you're, Carnap has this nice part where he says that, what we know, like everything is from within science, right? He has a nice statement of that. I had it on a slide earlier and then I deleted it. And I think that there are two different ways of looking at that. So Carnap does say everything that we know from science. And we can give a list of the sentences from science and so forth. You all know the quote I'm talking about, right? There's a quote where he says this. And it sounds very similar to the sort of Quinean working from within position. And many people have kind of noted that, not many people, but people have noted this connection. But I think that there is a difference in the sense that Carnap talks about multiple frameworks. And so there can be multiple frameworks of axioms, especially in ESO, right, in 1950. there are multiple frameworks in pluralism and the principle of tolerance and so forth. And so I think that's just a different approach, right? I think that's something else. That's not trying to sort of arrive at a set of foundational propositions. And so I do definitely support a sort of anti-foundationalist reading of Carnap, whether in terms of the autopsychological basis or in terms of the axioms of physics or the axioms of science. I think that foundationalism is, I don't think that he's a foundationalist in that way. So I guess that is something that I would definitely defend. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I think we can close here. And
we have a question. We have a question which has been written down in.
I didn't see it.
Yes. Is from Rokas Vaisilius, Vaisiulis, if I say it correctly. I don't know.
Oh yes, I see. Yes.
You want me to read it for you? So
no, I can see it now. Sorry, I didn't have the chat up. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Brentano and neo-Kantianism. Yes. Ha. An easy question right at the end. Okay, so yes, that's a great question. Oh my gosh. Let's see. So I'll get to Brentano. Neo-Kantianism, I think Alan just left. So I think the question of intentionality is a very interesting question. And a huge question, right? You could write a lot about Carnap and because there is actually a kind of parallel tradition. So Brentano obviously had this analysis of intentionality in perception and psychology. There's a kind of parallel set of researchers in physiology of perception who were looking at the influence of voluntary motion on psychological inferences and psychological action, right? So, and this is like, man, you could write 5 books on this, right? So Margaret Taylor Washburn, William James. So I should probably give a shout out to Alex Klein's recent book, Consciousness is Motor, on William James. And there was, at the end of the 19th century, like you could do a whole other talk or several of them about the notion of that voluntary motion and psychological intention has an actual occurrent impact on subjective experience and psychological experience, right? So this is a relatively little studied by philosophers. I think there's a lot of really good work on Brentano by Uriah Kriegel, among others, and not by me. And so I will say, I know that this tradition is important. I wouldn't even know where to begin in trying to connect it to what Carnap does with the Aufbau, but if there is a connection, that could be interesting, and I'll stop there. Neo-Kantianism, read Alan Richardson's book and Michael Friedman's work on that topic, is all I can say in 30 seconds. But thanks, that's a fantastic question.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. So Lydia, thank you very much. It has been really wonderful, this talk. And before thanking you again, let me remind all of you that the next meeting will be on the 5th of March with Erich Reck. And so I will advertise the next meeting soon. And so Lydia, thank you very much. We have enjoyed the session a lot. And I hope we will see us again soon.
Thank you everyone for a great discussion. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lydia. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.